In the middle of Africa sits a country called the Central African Republic. For a long time, this nation has faced many struggles, but between 2013 and 2014, something terrible happened there. The people, who had lived together peacefully for generations, turned against one another. It is a story of how political fights turned into something much darker, and how the world eventually tried to deliver justice for the victims. To understand what went wrong, you have to go back to March of 2013. A group of rebel fighters called the Séléka, which means alliance in the local language, swept through the countryside and took over the capital city of Bangui. They overthrew the president, a man named François Bozizé. The Séléka was mostly made up of people who practiced Islam, and their leader, Michel Djotodia, became the first Muslim president of the country. But the Séléka did not bring peace. Instead, witnesses reported that these fighters committed terrible acts. They killed innocent people, burned down villages, and stole from families who had done nothing wrong. The violence was so widespread that it left many communities in ruins. Now imagine you are a villager, watching your neighbor's home go up in flames. You feel afraid, but you also feel angry. This anger gave birth to something new. Groups of people, mostly Christians and animists, began to organize themselves into militias. They called themselves the Anti-Balaka. The name itself is interesting. Some say it comes from the words for anti-machete, but others believe it comes from a phrase meaning anti-AK-47 bullets, referring to charms the fighters wore that they believed could stop bullets. These groups started as self-defense units, but they quickly became something else. They began to seek revenge, not just against the Séléka fighters, but against anyone who was Muslim. A witness from the time told Human Rights Watch a horrifying story. She was forced to watch as anti-Balaka fighters cut the throats of her 3-year-old son and 2 other young boys, simply because they were Muslim males. At this point, you might be wondering why religion became such a big part of the fighting. The answer is complicated. The conflict was not really about religious beliefs or practices. For many years, Christians and Muslims in the Central African Republic lived together, intermarried, and shared neighborhoods. But the Séléka rebels were mostly Muslim, and they had committed horrible crimes. So when the Anti-Balaka rose up to fight them, they started to see all Muslims as the enemy. The Anti-Balaka fighters began a campaign to drive every Muslim out of the western part of the country. They surrounded towns and created what people called a red line. Any Muslim who tried to cross that line risked being shot. They killed hundreds, maybe thousands, and burned mosques to the ground. The goal, as some fighters stated, was to rid the country of Muslims forever. Out of all the militia leaders, 2 men stood out. Their names were Alfred Yekatom and Patrice-Edouard Ngaïssona. They were very different from each other, but they both played key roles in the violence. Yekatom was a battlefield commander. People called him Rambo, which was also the name of a violent movie character, but most just called him Rambo. He commanded about 3,000 fighters and personally led attacks. The court that later tried him heard evidence that he praised his men when they committed atrocities. He was a man of action, a fighter on the ground. Patrice-Edouard Ngaïssona was a different kind of leader. Before the war, he was an important figure. He had been a government minister and even served as the president of the Central African Football Federation, which is a big deal in any country. But when the conflict started, he took on a new role. He became the national political coordinator for the Anti-Balaka movement. While Yekatom was in the streets fighting, Ngaïssona was organizing, making plans, and giving orders. He helped direct the campaign of violence from a higher level. The 2 men worked together, one commanding on the ground and the other coordinating from above, to lead the Anti-Balaka forces during the worst months of the crisis. The violence did not go unnoticed. Around the world, people were horrified by the reports coming out of the Central African Republic. The government of the country realized they could not handle the situation on their own. So, they did something important. They asked the International Criminal Court, which is a permanent court in The Hague, Netherlands, to step in and investigate. The court agreed, and in 2014, they opened a formal investigation. It took several years, but eventually, the investigators found Yekatom and Ngaïssona. Yekatom was turned over by authorities in his own country in 2018. Ngaïssona was arrested in France the same year. Both men were sent to The Hague to stand trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The trial began in February of 2021. It was a complex case that lasted more than 4 years. The lawyers for the prosecution had to prove what these men did. They brought in witnesses who had survived the attacks. One woman named Rabiatu told the court her story. She said she was raped and her home was looted when anti-Balaka fighters attacked her town in December of 2013. She told reporters that since that day, she has felt stigmatized. People in her community called her the rebel's wife. She had to live in exile for 8 years. The trial was also notable for something new. The prosecutors used a lot of digital evidence. They looked at Facebook messages and posts. They examined phone records to see who was talking to whom and where people were located at certain times. This modern detective work helped build a clear picture of how the militia leaders organized their campaign. Finally, on July 24, 2025, the judges made their decision. They found both men guilty of multiple crimes, including murder, torture, and persecuting Muslim civilians. Alfred Yekatom, the so-called Rambo commander, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Patrice-Edouard Ngaïssona, the former football official, was sentenced to 12 years. Now, how did the victims feel about this outcome? The news traveled all the way back to the Central African Republic. In the capital, Bangui, people gathered at the ICC office to watch the verdict on a giant screen. For many, the feelings were mixed. A woman named Euphrasie Nanette Yandoka, who leads a group that supports victims, said she was happy that the men were convicted, but she admitted the sentences felt low. The victims had hoped for the maximum sentence of 30 years. For them, the pain they endured cannot be measured in years. What they really want now is help. They are asking for reparations. They want things like a vocational training center to learn new skills, or a shelter for victims, or even a museum that tells their story, so the world does not forget what happened to them. The convictions of Yekatom and Ngaïssona are historic. They mark the very first time the International Criminal Court has convicted leaders of the Anti-Balaka militia. For the Central African Republic, this is a huge step. A human rights expert named Louis Mudge said the verdict sends a very strong message to other rebel leaders who are still out in the bush. It tells them that one day, they might also have to answer for their crimes. If you found this story interesting or learned something new today, here's a simple way to help. Give this video a thumbs up. It might not seem like much, but it actually helps more people discover these kinds of stories. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. That way, whenever a new video comes out about another topic from around the world, you'll be the first to know. And one more thing. Sharing videos like this with a friend or family member who enjoys learning about current events is a great way to start a conversation. Thanks for watching and stay curious.